Oh, geez. Hello, everyone. Pastor Dave, going live today, trying to establish the premise of my series here. This is a religious political show. Eventually, I would like it to be an sort of call-in program. I am a pastor in that I do have a certificate of ordination. It is through a Christian ministry, but quite frankly, I only paid $32, and I was given this little certificate. I am actually an atheist, but I do believe or value some of the perspectives that Jesus Christ lived and died for. And so I have no problem talking about my love of Christ in a very specific framework. So I know that's sort of a weird thing, but I don't believe in the divinity of Christ. I don't think Christ was the Son of God. I don't think he was in heaven before creation, that he was sitting at the right hand of God and then was sent to earth to, create the scenario that most Christians think, and that is to set up his death as a sacrifice for everyone else, eternal salvation. I don't think Jesus thought himself that way. Those stories were added later, significantly later, like 1, 2, 3 centuries after Christ died. Some of the earlier books, like Mark, doesn't indicate that Jesus was the Son of God. At least they don't give the indication that he thought of himself as the Son of God. All these other authors have sort of added that quality, and as they sort of evolved, it became necessary to think about the Trinity concept, which is quite humorous, because if you give God the Father, the role of God, and then you have God the Son as also a God, and then this mysterious quality called the Holy Ghost as yet a third God, now all of a sudden your insistence on monotheism becomes polytheism. And so there was a lot of, wrangling around, and someone came up with this idea that, okay, well, we'll have this Trinity idea, the idea of 3 gods in one, that they're really just sort of different aspects of God. They are gods, yet somehow they really are just different expressions of the one true God. So already, Christians had made up things that weren't what Christ had originally said. I know it's debatable whether Christ existed or not. I have no reason to doubt there was some guy that, sort of claimed himself to be some kind of Messiah, some kind of savior, and he really wanted to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. And there are some qualities of his thinking that I think are worth preserving, but most of the ideas are not worth keeping. And so, that's just my personal belief. It's not something, and I think it's important to kind of extract the value, and I'll just tell you the 4 values that I feel have value is the value of non-judgment. Christ, at least, has been reported to say that it is important that we not judge others. Not only lest we be judged, but that it is just wrong. That it's a perspective where judging others can't possibly be of value because we're all flawed. We're all falling short of the glory of God. So how can you judge anyone who falls short of the glory of God when you yourself obviously have fallen short of the glory of God. And I think that's that's probably the most important one, because our habit of judging others is so outrageous. But avoiding that, or trying not to give in to the judgment of others, sets you on a proper path, a proper relationship with your understanding of Christ. So Christ wants you to do this because he understands that by developing a sense of non-judgment, you're going to actually be able to create that sense of purpose, or that sense of, we'll even say divine, that connection can happen because you're not continually miring yourself into the shallow or lesser quality of judging. Of course, we need to judge our situation, but to be judgmental, to condemn others for being human beings and, that are flawed human beings, just doesn't serve the greater purpose of bringing peace on earth and learning to love yourself and others and such. And those are actually part of the value system that I find useful. But again, I do not think of Jesus as the Messiah. I don't think of him as the Son of God, whatever has been said to that. But I do think that he is one of those rare human beings that was able to put his own human, we'll call them dark angels, in perspective. He was able to say, okay, yes, I know how to deal with my sort of lesser qualities, my more violent, my more reactionary qualities, and really kind of line myself up and connect myself to, the better angels of my nature. Whether they're actually angels or not, I don't want that to be an argument. Just the idea that if you sort of consider our lesser qualities are all really rooted in fear and hatred and anger, all those they're very earthy, they're very worldly. We're just trying to survive, so we have to have these qualities. And, they did serve a purpose, keeping those that are going to harm us, eat us, whatever, because it's that kind of a world we live in. But Jesus rose above all that and embraced the idea of non-judgment. And of course, perhaps certainly the best known of the Christian value, and that is forgiveness. I mean, we're talking like super forgiveness, where you forgive your enemies, forgive anyone that has somehow harmed you or condemned you. So that's a very powerful value. So that combination of that, and I kind of see them in a sort of progressive way, that you start out with the idea that, at least stop judging each other. And then when you really kind of get into that habit where you're not just instantly judging or condemning others for just being human beings who are flawed, then you can go on to real forgiveness, the depth of forgiveness that allows you this one step closer to connecting to something truly beyond human nature. And then, of course, once you establish the non-judgment and the forgiveness, you will then come into a sense of love, a love for yourself, because you realize, in your own perspective, that however flawed creation is, there are ways to get to the point where you can love yourself, love other human beings, even those people that are your enemy, because you sort of see the bigger picture. You can see that we do have it within our own power to bring that kind of love throughout the earth, and sort of in a global way, and ultimately to bring in peace within yourself and for the whole world. So that's kind of an interesting progress that I can see happening. I mean, you could almost do it in sort of therapeutic steps. We know, we have to acknowledge our own, I don't want to call it a sin, but our own habit of judging not only others, but ourselves. So it's not good that we just maintain that quality. In fact, constantly stay in that state of judgment. Because if you are in that state of judgment, then you're not lifting yourself up to some kind of higher consciousness. You're not able to do that, and that's unfortunate, because it is such an important step for you to at least stop that kind of earthly habit that you start to, and when you stop judging others and yourself, when you realize, okay, I know I'm flawed, I know I'm doing this or that, I'm being angry, I'm jealous, I'm acting out in fear and hate, I gotta forgive myself, well, at least stop judging myself, and then that will allow you to pursue the next level of consciousness where you can begin to forgive yourself as well as everyone else. And you really have to, forgiveness is very hard. Jesus talks about forgiving 7 times 70. I mean, he expected you to keep doing it. It is one of those constant things that you have to work your mind so that you can achieve a state of forgiveness that allows you to then love yourself. So when you're at that point where you're loving yourself because you've stopped judging yourself and you're forgiving yourself, and of course you've expanded that idea that you're not judging others and you're forgiving others, now you can really love others. Not in a romantic way, not even as family, but sort of in a, the globalistic sort of agape, just love of humanity, love of creation. Those are pretty powerful levels of consciousness that you've now lifted, separated yourself from your sort of animalistic, base reactionary qualities, and now you've moved out well enough. You're at the level of love. You're at the conscious level of love, not just yourself, but everyone else, that you can really begin to see how it's going to turn into, at the very least, a sense of peace within yourself. So you have come to a level of peace, of acceptance about your humanistic, animalistic qualities, and you can definitely see yourself 2, 3 levels of consciousness beyond that allows you to see in a broader context, in a global context. And it might actually be possible that when you really can generate that kind of peace within yourself, that you can actually generate a sense of peace with others. And if enough people can really establish this kind of peace, then sure, we might actually bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. And actually, but Jesus, in my estimation, Jesus' idea, and I put it in step form. I know he doesn't really formally do that, but so I'm sort of organizing it in this kind of progressive way, just because I find that kind of a useful and very uplifting way of looking at things. And again, I don't think of Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior. It is unnecessary. It is just somebody that I can admire, that if he, in fact, whatever, these words are available in the Bible. This kind of perspective is there. I'm not making it up, but I'm just taking what little I can out of the Bible, because most of the Bible tends to be, they talk about genealogy and prophecy and a lot of, punishment. So there's a lot of judgment, and there's a lot of all these other qualities, old and new, that, you really don't have much use for that. And so I extracted what makes sense to me, that I find useful. So those are the bases, that sort of 4 value system of Christ. tends to be the value system that I would put under the category of faith. These are my faithful values. I am not a Christian in any formal sense. I'm not associated with the church. I don't even think, well, I am an atheist, especially when it comes to the notion that the God of Abraham is the one true God. And I understand that sounds horribly blasphemous, but nonetheless, I still think that the Bible has proven to have some value, considering what its message is for the most part. The angry God of Abraham is quite vindictive and vengeful and scary. I mean, he is really the root of the faithful fear. And the idea that you add hell into the mix, and those are all useless kind of elements. I mean, they prove over and over just how not helpful all those qualities are. And it actually gives people this sense that they somehow have justification to instill the vengeance of God into regular people. And that's where the condemnation, I mean, let's face it, God is constantly judging in the Old Testament, especially, but also in the New. There's definitely condemning elements in both the Old and New Testament. And that's what we've learned. I mean, if this is what was given to us, and God is the example, he is the father that we kind of grew up with, then it is no wonder that we have a faith rooted in jealousy and hatred and judgment, the constant judgment, the inability to forgive, because God doesn't even really forgive. Forgiveness really didn't come around, at least in the Christian, Judeo-Christian context, until Jesus thought of it. I mean, there were some elements of it in the Old Testament, but it wasn't really a centerpiece of spiritual development. Whereas it is with Christ. That was a very important element. So those are the things that I've embraced. Doesn't mean I'm a Christian. I'm just saying, hey, I mean, like I like a lot of things that Socrates talked about. I like a lot of things that Plato talked about. I like a lot of things that Aristotle talked about. But then there's a lot of things that I didn't like about him. But we're not talking about the secular thinking. We're just talking about those people that adhere to their faith. This somehow they think because of their faith, they're above all forms of logic or, scientific evidence, and that all they have to do is believe, and the belief becomes the fact. And that to me is the problem. So I've established my value system, and that's on the faith side of it, even though I'm not religious. In fact, I consider myself an atheist, because none of the gods that men have described can possibly be a true God. They're just so horribly flawed. It would make no sense at all if a God has the deep qualities of, omnibenevolence or omnipresence or omniscience. Then you just are going to get into this horrible realization that if a God has the knowledge to bring good, and there really is no good, but humans are just suffering and have been suffering for millions of years, why is it that God, who knows what's going to happen to us and supposedly is a benevolent God, then why doesn't he? Wouldn't you, if you were a parent and you had the knowledge of what's going to happen to your children, and you always represent the best and the most benevolent of qualities, of course you would try to help your children. You would protect them, you would do the best that you can, and it's just not of any use to me why we have to have such a destructive God as the foundation of all of our beliefs, when the best of all of that really comes down to what I consider just 4 values, and I talked about them. So it got me to think. It's like, okay, how can somebody believe what they believe if the four best values of non-judgment, forgiveness, love, and peace have come out of it. So, the tradition, as flawed as it is, does have some elements that can actually be beneficial to humanity. So you don't throw everything out, but it does make me wonder, all right, how do you put those basic values that you have as part of your faith into your political action? And that really brings us to the full point of why why I'm on the air, why I'm trying to express this, because it doesn't really matter what is being talked about. It doesn't matter which political issue you want to address. What it all comes down to is, does your faith, does your religious values line up with your political values? And my premise here is that it doesn't. Let's see here if I can try this. Is that on there? I'm trying to get this to get to. Is that too many? I guess so. I guess I have to really cut and paste this thing to death. All right. Let's do this again. All right. Let's start here. All right. Let's try a few of these. Let's see how many. All right. Yeah, let's go with this number. All right. Delete, and then we have 425. Really? Jesus, you really don't get much, do you? Delete. 301. All right, let's see what we got. Anti-global warming. All right, too bad. 175. Okay, there we go. So now we can add that. All right, there's a whole list of political issues, and you can add any. This is a chat program. I don't have a nice phone. This is my rudimentary effort to try to share my faith and political beliefs. And if you happen to pass by in the internet and want to comment, please do. Anyway, we'll talk about the first one. You can't be anti-gun control and still be a Christian. Now, I have a list of about 10, 12 political issues, and I'm just basing the assumption on that all of the social conservative issues, social conservative, fiscally conservative, even fiscal conservatism, is contrary to the best of your faith values. So we'll start with gun control. I mean, it should be obvious. At least it is to me. But this is where I would want you to say it. Let's say you are a Christian and you believe that you not only have the right to have a gun, but that there should be no laws to suppress what you might call the right of the Second Amendment, which allows you the right to bear arms. So that's your right. You do not see any kind of contradiction with your values as a Christian and your values as an American and your right to do. I understand that I'm not here to dispute that the Second Amendment is not part of the Constitution, because it clearly is, and it served its purpose. It kept us from being overtaken again by British interests. So you can't argue that the Second Amendment did not serve. But as a Christian, and you are about love and peace, because those are the values that are at the highest level of your faith. All these other sort of following the rules of your Bible, there is some importance in that. You should not be breaking the law. But as a peace lover, as a pacifist, Christ did not want you to take up arms. And I need you, if you think he did, he actually wanted you to take up arms, then I would challenge you to at least provide me the biblical verses that actually sort of support your anti-gun control position, where Christ not only says, we know if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Some of these things that he's talking about, whatever verse you think that actually defends or supports your political viewpoint, that not only should you carry a gun, but that you should prevent and keep away any kind of effort to make gun ownership a little safer, meaning that you provide background checks, you provide some kind of check on the weapons, that all weapons should be identified and they should be registered and and if you can't even allow any of that, I'd be interested in knowing, well, what is your perspective? Does the Bible say you have the right to bear arms, that you have the right, and that no law should be created to keep you from being able to have your weapons? I'm hoping I'm arguing your position properly, or I'm stating your position in that I understand there are probably several levels. Like some people might be in favor of a background check. They might be also in favor of at least registering guns, so that guns, and maybe allow for a 3-day wait period, or anything that where gun ownership at least has an established identity of the owner, and hopefully enough of a background check that there's at least no history to indicate that somebody will use the gun improperly or not. But so I know there are going to be gradations, but I'm going to go on the assumption that most people who are against gun control are so completely. They don't want, it's more like the NRA's position, where they want absolutely nothing. It's an all or nothing proposition. You either have no protection, no kind of inhibition of the expression of that law, or that you completely get rid of it. And of course, they have to state it that way. So if everybody lives in the fear that they're going to be without their guns, I'm fine with that. Whatever that position is, I think at any level of those positions, as long as you feel a need to bear arms, that you're not really living your true Christian faith. Because of what I consider Jesus' probably most profound level of consciousness, we'll call it, his most profound, we'll even call it a revelation, that we really do want to try to bring the kingdom of God, the notion of this heaven on earth. And we can do this by living a life of peace, by not living your life by using weapons, by not. And if you can just counter that argument, if you can just say, no, the Bible says, Jesus came with a sword and he was going to wield that sword, and then of course I'd have to ask, well, why would you think he came with a sword, a literal sword? And this is where I'd like that kind of dialogue. You need to help me understand how you support your political viewpoint with your faithful viewpoint. That's the whole purpose of this. There's no other angle than that. Because, so here's an opportunity. We'll get right into the weeds. We go right into the context of whatever the Bible says, or if let's say you're Muslim, and your Muslim sacred text, your Quran, describes in specific detail how important it is for you to own weapons, and how to wield those weapons, and how to use those weapons in the name of God or Allah. So I want to know that. Again, I'm going to operate from a principle of ignorance. I have studied the Bible, not in any real formal sense, but I've read it several times. My sense is that even in Islam, as much of the jihadist philosophy of war, actually holy war, not just a holy war within yourself, which is there, but yet you actually are to commit war, and that you really are not a religion of peace. So my contention is, well, I think Muhammad wanted you to live a life of peace. He did want you to be in this place of jihadi expression of, or not even war, well, even a jihadi war within yourself. And that makes sense to me. I mean, that's kind of what I think Christ was talking about. That's why he gave specifics about not judging and, try to avoid that impulse to judge and to really live a life of forgiveness. Muhammad talks about forgiveness. I don't know if the Quran specifically says that you should live a life of war and not live a life of peace. I think ultimately the Quran, now again, this is where I would want you to correct me if I'm wrong. So gun ownership and your faith values should not jive. You're supposed to have this higher level of consciousness, which would get you to realize, if we really want to love humanity, if we really want to wish what is best for humanity, then we would want to not have weapons. So if you personally are a person of deep faith, then you personally shouldn't own a gun or any kind of weapon. And you should have or be compelled not to use it in any way. I understand that people are violent, and I understand people are reactionary, but you are trying to live an example of faith rooted in peace and faith rooted in a more global perspective of how to bring peace on earth through love and forgiveness and non-judgment. And even though I can definitely identify those things in Christian texts, I definitely think they exist in the Quran. And if not, I'm sure, if you're a terrorist and you find this whole line offensive, then you can point out all of the text within the Quran that supports your right or your purpose or your mission to, in fact, inflict war on the non-believers. But ultimately, I don't think Muhammad wanted that. But I'm willing to stand corrected on that because that's your power. All right, let's see. We'll move on from anti-gun control. So to me, clearly that's in contradiction. If you feel you need weapons and yet you still believe or have the strong faith, then you're living a life of contradiction because your faith should not really support your need to possess guns. You shouldn't really have that need. I understand that when we lived in a life where we hunted and hunting animals to survive, that's a different purpose of, I'm sure Jesus didn't object to his own fishermen fishing to consume fish, and the weapon was the net, and the net was allowed you to kill fish. So I don't think we're talking about that kind of. I don't think there's any kind of contradiction. So let's not exaggerate the idea that Jesus didn't want any kind of killing. He readily ate fish and meat and even drank wine. So let's not, confound the issue. We're just talking about you taking up weapons against other human beings. And I realize other human beings are dangerous and they could easily use their weapons, but you're trying to set the example. You're trying to live the life of peace and love. forgiveness, and non-judgment. Those four basic values, that's what you're trying to do. And you do so knowing that in doing so, you're trying to lift up humanity as a whole. So your faith is what gives you the strength to stand against all of the sort of baser, lesser, more violent impulses of humanity. And the way you stand up in that courage of your faith is not through violence, it's through peace. So I'm trying to move on to the next issue, but that one's like a major one for me. All right, let's go on. Let's say you can't be anti-immigration and still be a Christian. Yeah, that one doesn't make sense. Jesus certainly wanted you to lift up those who were in need, and you should open up your arms to those that come from other lands. He was not an anti-immigrant. I understand that Jesus wasn't in the capacity of a government, but still, the attitude towards immigrants or people from foreign lands is one of warmth and openness and compassion. It's not one of, condemnation and judgment and making the assumption that all immigrants are dangerous and should be put in jail if they somehow come to your land illegally. I'm sure that concept was a little fuzzy back then. I mean, people were probably free to move throughout the Roman Empire, but still, I mean, there were, I'm sure, some kind of controls. But in Jesus' mind, there was no inconsistency at all. If someone was from a foreign land, and that's my position. Again, he's showing compassion. He's showing a love of other human beings, no matter where they were from and no matter what ethnic group. That was not a distinction. So you would not make laws to keep people out of your land, out of your country. You should definitely have a sense of compassion. Now, if you believe that immigrants, that we should close our borders, I don't know how extreme your immigration policy is, but let's say you want no one. That America has had enough immigrants, we don't want any more. No one from anywhere can come to our country. Some people believe that. And of course, the other extreme is that we don't actually have borders. And if anybody wants to come into our country, we should all open arm, welcome them. And whatever your belief is, Jesus was not an organization. So yeah, he was always welcoming people into his home. And he thinks that you should do the same. So if we have enough people who are willing to open their arms up for people from another land that are in need of support and food and basic needs, then, if you have a country full of people who are willing to open up their houses to a family, or, not everyone in the world, that's not what we're talking about, but you shouldn't be closed to that. Or maybe you should. Maybe there's something in the Bible that says you should not have an immigration policy that allows anyone to come to your land, those that are from another land, a foreign land. Jesus had an opinion on that. So, and it's not, so being anti-immigrant, I mean, obviously there has to be some kind of, some kind of ability. Like we definitely want to help people around the world who are suffering, who are being oppressed, who are being starved, who have to live in famine. And, we should definitely have some way of reaching out to help as many people as we can. And I understand there's only so many things that we have, but we should be willing to give as much of what we have as we can, because that's your Christian faith. I don't know what Muhammad teaches about helping others, but I know he has that the belief that, your purpose in life was to help others who needed help, those less fortunate than you. Then that was part of your purpose. So I think even Muhammad would have embraced the notion that that we should help those, even if they are from a foreign land. But if you can show me in the text where, in fact, Jesus or Muhammad or your sacred leader tells you specifically to keep immigrants out, then I'll stand corrected. So far, the idea of gun control is against your faith. The idea of keeping immigrants out of your land is not consistent with your faith. All right, let's try another issue. You can't be anti-LGBTQ rights and still be a Christian or a person of faith. And I know the Bible is loaded, especially with homosexual references that say no, like a man can't lie with a man like he would with a woman. I mean, that's pretty clear. He's not allowed to do that. And if he does, he's supposed to be put to death. Now, does Jesus comment about the LGBT? I mean, if you're a Christian and the New Testament is supposed to sort of put more perspective on the Old Testament, in that not every single rule, I mean, technically, every part of the Old Testament was supposed to be part of the system of the New Testament. But Jesus at least had the perspective that we really should not judge others. And the reason was that, we're all sinners. We are all falling short of the glory of God. So we get that. And that should be enough of a reason for you to recognize, okay, if somebody is in sin, I know the Bible allows you to kill that person. So somebody is found out to be gay, or even admits that they are gay. Well, they wouldn't use gay, that they slept with a man slept with a man. And I just want to know how this is my feeling, is that the New Testament clearly takes away all that you shouldn't be killing people for having sinned. Because that would have been, if you commit adultery, well, at least if women commit adultery, then they're killed. And if that is the world you want, that's the politics you want sort of that Old Testament law to be the law of our land, the law of the United States, where that you create a law where if you, in fact, catch somebody, or somebody admits that they are a homosexual, that you would kill them, that is consistent with your idea of being a Christian, the idea of forgiveness, the idea of non-judgment. And I don't think that works, that you would instill or create a law that makes it illegal for a man to marry a man, or a man to lie with a man, or a man to have sex with a man, however specific you need it, that you feel that there should be a law that means you would kill that person if they're found guilty of, which I assume you would have some kind of due process where the person would you'd have to bring evidence to show that, yes, he is in fact a homosexual, and yes, he is in fact committed sodomy, or whatever it is that you need. Once you have that evidence, you would in fact put that person to death. And should that really be what a Christian thinks? And I say no. Jesus had his core values, and they're fundamentally opposed to killing somebody. You do not act on it. You should stand in non-judgment. You should stand in forgiveness. You should stand in love. Have compassion. To me, those are the stronger values. So the rights of people should be protected. And if you want God to judge, and I realize if you really believe that the God of Abraham is in fact the one true God, then therein lies the contradiction for you. Well, which one do you go with? Do you go with your Old Testament God or do you go with your New Testament God? So which God do you follow? How do you apply the value systems of Christ with this idea that you have to create civil law that makes it illegal to be a homosexual? And then in turn, if they're found to be guilty, that you have no problem killing that person for having lived what you would call a life of sin. If you really go by that standard, we all have to go to jail and we all have to be killed because we all commit sins. And Jesus came not to condemn, but to forgive. And if you really are a Christian and you really have the value of forgiveness as part of your faith, then there's no way you can be anti-LGBTQ rights. You should acknowledge that they have the right to exist, and whatever you believe that they're sinning, that is between them and God, and that is to be dealt with in the afterlife. And you should not impose laws that lead to the death of anyone who has sinned. Because if you start doing that, if it is against the law to be a homosexual, then it's against the law to commit adultery. It's against the law to do a number of things. And you could impose Old Testament punishment. And I don't believe that's what Jesus was about. He didn't want you to impose Old Testament justice on people, because you start getting into that, you start killing everybody. There's so many reasons for you to kill somebody because they have sinned. Not just sinned by committing the sin of homosexuality, but by the sin, perhaps even the sin of divorce, the sin of adultery, even the sin, if you will, of eating lobster. I mean, if you really are going to go that direction, there's going to be a lot of people on death row. And if you really have that belief, then you really aren't Christian. You really don't have the value of non-judgment and faith or forgiveness in your heart. Then, to me, that means if you don't even have these fundamental values, then you don't have Christ in your life. You're not really a Christian. I'm not sure what you are, but the fact that you are so willing to condemn others, even if they just live in another land, or because they live a life of sin, however you judge that. And that's the problem. Jesus wants you to stop the judgment. He says, well, how do we protect ourselves from the evil that people, yes, I mean, there are going to be laws on the books. And yes, we need to think in terms, okay, if somebody is in the business of stealing, really, you're going to kill people who are stealing? I mean, is that really? I think you should create real judicial reform where those people who are committing crimes, let's call them crimes instead of sins, because we are all sinners. Remember, if you just think of lust, that's a sin. Jesus is very clear that your ability to sin is without bound. Because if you just think about sinning, you've sinned. And if you really want to get into the weeds about how, okay, every sin has to be punished on earth. Yet Jesus supposedly came to forgive us for our sins. You're really going to have a hard time distinguishing between the thought crime of lusting with the actual crime of homosexuality or adultery or incest or whatever it is. And so if the thought crime isn't really harming people, then there are, and the others are harmed. You have to decide now, what are the ones that we need to really protect ourselves from? Really? Adultery, consenting adults, homosexuality, consenting adults, it's really not causing harm. You're creating a sense of harm that does not exist, and you want civil law to put people to death for those kind of sins, then you really can't be Christian. So what you do need to do is really pick on those things. Like if somebody's stealing, and they're stealing everywhere, not just because they're starving, but they're actually stealing your car, they're stealing things that you own, then yes, you need to put them in jail and try to get them to reform. Try to get them into a place where you can do something more productive than steal. We need you to learn a trade. We need you to educate yourself. We need you to start being a productive part of society so that your reform allows for redemption as opposed to just killing everybody who commits a sin. So justice reform is more important than ever before. But the identified crimes have to be crimes that harm innocent people. Homosexuality does not do that. It does not harm other people. If somebody, molests or rapes or does something like that, now you're talking. Now there's not consent. There's not consenting desire. There is a violation of a person's rights. There's some kind of act of violence being committed. So what do? You do not kill them. You do not use the death penalty. You isolate them in a jail system and build reforms to see if they can change and become better people who stop hurting others. Even a Charles Manson. Yes, that's all tied in with this. This whole LGBTQ issue is broader than that. Because if you start killing people who live their life by the LGBTQ sexual alternative lifestyle that they do, and you decide, well, they can't do that, even though they're doing so in their own business, not harming others, they're falling in love, they are developing relationships, and you decide, no, they're not harming other people, they're not violating. If they do, and I'm sure it could happen within their community, that somebody is involved in a relationship where they're having sex with somebody but does not want to have sex. So they rape them, just like heterosexuals raping other people, or raping children, or raping people who cannot provide consent, then that's a different issue. Those people need to be isolated. They are not capable of acting in peace and love and with respect to others. They're committing acts of crime. They're harming other people. So that's why the whole justice reform has to be based on the idea of non-judgment forgiveness with the hope of redemption. Now, they may not. Charles Manson is a perfect example of that. He, by most people's standards, should have been put to death. I'm sure you think that. But he wasn't, because there was no death penalty in California. And of course, you'll say, well, that's the problem with California. No, that's not the problem. We should not have a death penalty. As a Christian, you should not consider the death penalty a Christian value. No, because what you're doing is, again, you're throwing your justice system back into the hands of an Old Testament way of thinking, and you can't do that. You've got to lift yourself out of that. Jesus gave you the means to do that, and now you should be acting in forgiveness and love and peace. And you should not be judging others so harshly that they are put to death. You cannot have that system. That if you sin in just egregiously enough, that you put that person to death. They're going to end up killing way, way too many people. So you have to have more of a reform system based on forgiveness and the idea of redemption, the idea of somehow helping somebody lift themselves out of their sin or their need to harm others. And that's why you should not be anti, or that you should not punish people in the LGBTQ community. You can't do that. Those are not sins that harm others. They're not. That's why they're not even sins. Really, we're talking about crime. They're not crimes, and they're not crimes that should be punishable, because you have a Christian value of forgiveness and non-judgment, and you really have to modify or modernize your thinking to recognize that crimes are really crimes that harm other people, that reject or deny other people their right to live in safety, their right to live in fairness and love and liberty. They should have freedom. If somebody is violating somebody's freedom by taking their property, by harming them physically, by doing the things that are essentially violent, you don't kill them. Even those that are clearly acting against the will of other people's rights, we wouldn't kill them, because we want to embrace the idea of forgiveness. We have to keep them out of society. That's true. We still need a jail system, but within that jail should be genuine reform. All right. We have to offer you education. We have to offer you ways, not necessarily religious ways, but the idea of imposing the idea that, all right, you know why you're in jail? You're in jail because you raped this person, and you even admit you did it, where you're not allowed to hurt some people. You're not allowed to do that. So we can't let you out until you realize the error of your ways. And we have to do that until they change. And you have to risk that they have changed, that they've improved their life, that they've given themselves a chance to live in an alternative way. And however many years it takes to do that, you make sure that they have a job skill that's marketable, you have the means to be able to take care of themselves, that they find better ways to express themselves and their anger than just harming people. Anyway, that should be, so that's really several issues. Leave the LGBT community alone. They are not harming other people. They are not committing crimes. They are not violating the rights of other people. Leave them alone. Don't go down that path. Jesus doesn't want you to. And you shouldn't want you to. He wants you to live a life and have a reform system based on forgiveness and love, with the hope of their own redemption. Not only afterlife redemption, but in-life redemption. That's how you should have judicial reform. So that's one issue. Leave the LGBT community alone. These are not crimes. leave them alone. That is not inconsistent with your Christian beliefs. And you need to come to terms with that. So your social conservative position of being anti-LGBTQ is not a Christian perspective. You need to change that. You need to give that up. You do not need to impose the death penalty on people who you think are violating. If you're standing in judgment of other people who are not committing crimes, then you need to change. You have to change. That's not good. That's not a Christian perspective. All right, so you're okay. So we really kind of covered a lot of things. You can't be anti-LGBTQ and consider yourself a Christian. If you really have the values, the base values of Christianity, of Christ, and I identify them as non-judgment, forgiveness, love, and peace. If those are true values of you, whatever else you believe, I don't really care. But if these are part of your core value system, then you're not living a life as a Christian. You're living in the hypocrisy. If you're starting to pass judgment on the LGBTQ community and you want to impose violent punishment, then you're not living a life as a Christian. And you need to find a way to come to terms with that. I'm just pointing it out. And of course, I do acknowledge that people who do Hello? Oh, how you doing? Oh, yeah. Who's up? Oh, that's all right. Okay. Okay. Anyway, back to the show here. Son of a bitch. Okay. Well, I can't get into it, so I'm going to have to call it a day. It's interrupted. My apologies. We'll continue on another live stream. Thank you.